Hello everyone, and welcome to my new series for PokerStrategy.com on data analysis. I'm your coach Mark. I post under the moniker Leader on 2plus2 and PokerStrategy.com. In today's episode, we're going to look at understanding data. So what we want to do is we want to see how we can use data analysis to improve our games, what kind of data is useful and reliable, and also what kind of tools we can use to see that data and understand it. So the first thing we need to understand is why we're analyzing data at all. Data analysis can often be time-consuming and frustrating at times, so it's important to have a clear understanding for what kind of benefits you can get out of it. There are really two main categories. First, exploiting your opponents. So in exploitive analysis, what we're trying to do is we're trying to find our opponent's flaws. What does this opponent do that is not optimal, and we can take advantage of that. This relies on your understanding of hand analysis and other things in order for you to be able to identify those flaws. But even just with data analysis, you can often find ways to exploit opponents by simply looking and comparing how they play with you or with other good players. Because if they're doing something that's very different from what you're doing or whatever other good players are doing, it's most likely not a good strategy. And therefore you can think about what they're doing and adjust to it. The other very useful thing about data analysis is it allows you to identify your own flaws. You can do this in a number of ways. First, you can, again, look at other players, especially other very good players, and say, what are they doing that you're not doing? The other thing is you can look at your hands and the results of different strategies you've taken and see, is this strategy profitable or not? In future episodes, we're going to take a look at many practical examples of both of these approaches. A couple of quick examples, however, would be we can often find ways to exploit opponents by narrowing down to specific situations. Like, for example, when the opponent leads into a preflop raiser when they don't have the lead. In this type of situation, many players have an unbalanced range. So if you can filter down and examine the hands that they play, you may be able to find ways to exploit them. In terms of our own improvement, it's often a good idea to look at other players who do better than you, and to see how their stats differ from yours, and to consider how you might change your play to get closer to what they're doing. It's of course important to understand that even though a player may do something differently than you, and even though they may be better than you, that doesn't necessarily mean that that difference is what's causing you to be a worse player than they are. What's key is to see what the differences are, and then try to apply some kind of mathematics to the hands that make those differences, and see, are you playing correctly, or are they playing correctly? So now that we've gotten a sense for why we want to analyze data, we want to take a look at what kind of data we need. And so what we're really looking for is data that's both reliable and useful. Reliability refers to pretty technical things. We need things that are relatively well converged. In other words, we need large sample sizes, or we need to know how large the sample size needs to be. And we also need to know if the sample is biased. So we need to make sure that when we're choosing different sampling methods, that we try to pick those that will actually answer the questions that we're asking of data. We also need things or data that's useful. So when we talk about usefulness, it's a little bit more slippery. It's not really a technical thing. It's more about our understanding. It's more about what kind of questions are we asking at all, right? And whether or not the data can actually answer those questions. And that we don't ask questions that don't actually help us or achieve our goals. And so our goals here are to get better and to play better. So it's important to have a plan in place that allows us to go from analyzing data to understanding data to finding things to implement in our games and then actually implementing them. So for example, usefulness can come into play when we're looking at, for example, different board textures. What we want to analyze is mostly those situations that tend to come up a lot. When we look at different board textures, some board textures are much more common than others. For example, a board texture like a trips texture, where all the cards are the same rank, is not a very common texture. On the other hand, a texture where two of the cards connected and one of the cards is lower is a much more common texture, right? So if we're going to answer questions, right, and look in data for how players play on different textures, we want to make sure our focus is on the ones that are most useful, and those are the ones that are most common. This also applies more broadly to different types of situations. So, for example, there's a lot of situations where your opponent doesn't have the lead, they're out of position. How do they play in those situations? There are many fewer situations in which the pot's been 3-bet or 4-bet or 5-bet pre. So you want to make sure that you focus on first those situations which are most common. Over the long run, there's always opportunities to pick up small edges and uncommon spots, and we shouldn't ignore those things. But it's important when we start out with data analysis to start out with those situations which are common, which we have a lot of data for, and which can really help us improve our game quite a bit. In future episodes, we'll also take a look at both of these concepts and show some practical examples of each. Now let's take a look at what kind of tools we can use in order to analyze data. So we really need two categories of tools. First, we need tracking software. If you're new to poker or new to online poker, these are pretty necessary tools. You only need one of them. You either need Poker Tracker 3 or Hold'em Manager. Both cost somewhere between $50 and $80, I think, something like that. There are some free alternatives. I'm not terribly familiar with them, although I know that there's a thread in the 2+2 software forum for some free tracking software. So if you're pretty competent with computers, you might want to give that a try. Otherwise, I think both of these software packages are pretty good. I tend to use Poker Tracker 3, and the examples we see in the series will be Poker Tracker 3 examples. But most of the things that we talk about can also be used, also be done in Hold'em Manager. We also need some kind of statistical analysis software. I tend to use R, which is an open source software for statistical analysis. It can be a little bit intimidating. It's not point and click. It's a command line. But I think it's something that anyone can use, and it's not terribly complex for the basic things that we'll be doing. There are some other options: SAS, SPSS, Minitab. These are all commercial software. If you already have access to them and are familiar with them, they're certainly good options. I wouldn't recommend buying them. I believe that they're quite expensive. Possibly on the order of hundreds or thousands of dollars. So, but there are a lot of schools and offices that have access to these software, so if you're familiar with them, you can certainly use those. Also, Excel is another option for a lot of basic calculations that we're doing, and you can certainly try to do it in there. There's an open source alternative to Excel. It's called OpenOffice Calc, and I would certainly recommend that. I use OpenOffice for everything, and it's pretty comparable to Excel. To summarize, in this episode, we took a basic introduction to data analysis. So we looked at why we would do data analysis, both in terms of exploiting our opponents and improving our own games. We also looked at what kind of data we need. We need data which is mathematically reliable and well sampled, as well as useful data which answers our question. And finally, we took a look at some tools which you can use during this process. In forthcoming episodes of this series, we're going to take a more detailed look at what makes data reliable and useful. Then we're going to go on to look at several examples of ways in which you can analyze data to exploit your opponents and improve your own game. As always, if you have any questions or ideas about what kind of things you'd like to see in this series or other series you'd like to see, You can contact me through the video comments or through PM on PokerStrategy.com. You can also email me at leader2p2@gmail.com or find me on Skype or Twitter. This has been Leader for PokerStrategy.com.